Hello, I'm Carl Reichert, and I'm an associate research professor at the Applied Research Lab at Penn State University, and also a member of the graduate faculty in the graduate program in acoustics. I'm also one of the moderators for our CAV Roundtable on artificial intelligence and machine learning. In this video, I'd like to describe some of the applications of AI and ML that I've used in my work in prognostic health management, to try to give you an idea of some of the challenges and some of the advancements that have been made in AI and machine learning that are applicable in my field of research. As I mentioned, one of the areas that I work in is prognostic health management, or PHM. And let me share a couple of perspectives with you on how things have changed over the years. This slide shows what I call traditional prognostic health management. We would have a device, and in this case, what I'm showing is the mechanical diagnostics test bed that we built at Penn State over 20 years ago. We were collecting data on gearbox failures. So we instrumented the gearbox with fault-specific sensors that were determined through a reliability-centered maintenance process and a failure modes and effects criticality analysis. And as a result of that, we identified temperature sensors, vibration sensors, torque sensors, and other measurements that would give us insight into changes in the behavior of the gearbox as it degraded. And we would, the attempt or the goal in much of prognostic health management is to compute the remaining useful life of the component. How much longer can it operate at the given load and speed before it's going to fail? And these techniques typically relied on a single sensor or a combination of a limited number of signals with well understood correlations that we could then track and predict when they were going to cross a given threshold that was determined either through physics-based models or through experimental experience. Now, the field has changed a lot today, in that today we want to collect data from as many different data sources as possible, often not using sensors that were specifically installed based on a failure modes and effects analysis, and try to infer changes in the general operating characteristics of the system that we think are related to degradation in components and can be used to predict maintenance actions and when they need to occur. So from the assets, we're collecting information on asset usage, we're collecting sensor data, we're collecting direct observations of system health, operational records, and maintenance records. These are collected either autonomously from systems on board or through the interaction with maintenance personnel, operators, planners, logisticians, and others. Instead of focusing solely or relying solely on systems that might be deployed on board the platform, the trend has been to move that processing off board into the cloud. Now, one advantage of this is access to a much broader range of data than we would have if we were relying only on sensors that we could capture on board. You know, based on the cloud processing, we can develop usage models, we can develop classifiers for the regime of the operations, the health of the asset. We can look at load-dependent wear models, fault models, and conduct predictive analytics. Again, the big game changer here is that we're now, if you can follow my cursor, we're now looking at cloud-based solutions, and we're leveraging the latest developments in the fields of AI and machine learning. Things such as deep learning neural networks, multivariate statistic analysis, and reasoning techniques that can be borrowed from the artificial intelligence domain and autonomous systems. And finally, a little bit less applicable to our direct discussion today of AI and ML techniques. What we ultimately want to do is we want to be able to update these models, the thresholds, the extraction algorithms, and real-time AI kernels, and push those back to the platform to move the analysis from the cloud, which typically has can have a significant delay in terms of when the information gets there and can be acted on, and push those right to the platform in much the same way that image recognition software was once relegated to large desktop computers, but is now found embedded in your IoT devices, such as smart doorbells or your personal phone. Machine learning techniques cover a lot of different space and can be broken down based on how they're trained, how they're operated, what kind of analysis that they're doing. But the three main thrusts in machine learning today are in unsupervised learning, supervised learning, and reinforcement learning. And I'm going to focus today on examples of unsupervised and supervised learning as they're applied to the work that we're doing in PHM. You'll see references to things like classification, dimensionality reduction, and clustering in the subsequent slides. So machine learning approaches for health monitoring can fall into two broad general categories. There's fault and failure data used for machine learning and training, and there's healthy data approach. And that's a good example of that is the so-called digital twin modeling that is becoming popular. So on one hand, traditional machine learning in a supervised nature would use data that is from faulty systems, healthy systems, and where you have validated failure data. And that can be used to train the system to recognize those fault and failure conditions before they happen. The advantage is that you have a prognostic capability, meaning you know the ground truth of the remaining useful life at each point in the data leading up to the fault or failure. The disadvantage is it actually requires that data. In reality, even in systems where we are constantly collecting data from sensors and from the operations, we rarely know precisely what the health of the system is as it progresses from the healthy condition to the failed condition. Often the best we can do is we know when maintenance occurred, and if we have the ground truth from the maintenance action, we can work back from there and say that, okay, at this point we were 100 operating hours from failure, or we were 200 operating hours from failure. The healthy data approach uses data from a wide range of operating conditions during normal healthy state. And we don't have any fault data, but what we use instead is we use our machine learning algorithms to look at patterns in the operation and performance of the system that change over time. The implication being, or the assumption being, that we're slowly degrading our capability until we get to the point where we've had a failure or we've had a maintenance action. The subtle difference between these two is in the fault failure data machine learning approach, we know at each point how far we are from the failure. In the healthy data approach, we typically just know 2 points. We know when the system was put into operation in an assumed healthy condition, and we know when the system was taken out of operation in assumed faulted condition. So the question is, can an algorithm learn healthy and unhealthy sensor behavior from the device's entire history? And the processing flow for this looks like the diagram on this slide. So we define the healthy and unhealthy for the entire sensor history using, let's say, an operational logbook. So we're relying on the operators or the maintainers to keep a log of the health of the machine through its entire operating cycle. We evaluate a number of different modeling techniques to look at classifying that health. And then we can compare the ability of each modeling technique to predict the correct values of the respective testing data sets. So there's a lot to unpack here. The first is we need to choose a modeling technique to evaluate. Then we create testing and training data sets. We train models according to the chosen technique using the training data set. And then we try to predict the correct values of the testing data set. And in a typical project, we will look at numerous modeling techniques and a number of different training and testing approaches to try to come up with the one that gives us the best results of correctly classifying faulty conditions while not having a high number of false alarms, and also correctly classifying unhealthy conditions, again, without too many false positives or false negatives. In general, what we've seen in the field of machine learning is that the best solutions tend to be a composite of multiple techniques, and using some sort of fusion process or voting process, we then choose the one that tends to give the best performance for a given type of system with a given type of data. So as an example, here's one where we were looking at a machine that was designed to remove CO2 from the air. And the people working with this machine kept very detailed logbooks of all of the testing that they did, all of the operating hours, and all of the maintenance actions that were performed. So it was easy to identify healthy and unhealthy points in the data. So one of the things that we looked at was how far ahead do you search from a healthy condition for an unhealthy condition? And so if you look at the table on the slide here, if we looked at 50 cycles ahead from a given point in time, then the number of cycles with no incipient faults was around 3,000. And then the number of cycles with at least one incipient fault was around 4,000. Now, when we mean by a cycle, we mean a block of 50 points into the future. If we stretch that out to 100, then what we find is that the number of cycles with no faults goes down, and the number of cycles with at least one incipient fault goes up. Similarly, if we increase that to 200, we see that the number of cycles with no incipient faults drops down to about 600, and the number of cycles with at least one incipient fault goes to 6,000. So this should make sense to you. The further we look ahead, the less likely we are to have a clear block of time with no faults, and the more likely we are to have a block of time with a fault in it. And so one of the challenges that we have here is in breaking our data up into training and testing sets, we have to decide how big a window we want to use. Because the other thing that's not known is that in the 6,000 cycles where we have at least one incipient fault, we also don't know that we don't have two incipient faults or multiple faults that are compounding the behavior that we're seeing. So in this project, we evaluated a number of different modeling techniques. We looked at things like k-nearest neighbor classification, discriminant analysis, logistic regression, a naive Bayesian approach, random forests, and support vector machines. As I mentioned earlier, we don't know often until we apply these techniques to the data, which technique is going to work best for the data. That's actually a bit of a challenge in machine learning in general, is that we don't necessarily understand what it is about a particular type of data that makes one approach better than another. So the next step for each of these is to create training and testing data sets. So we looked at two approaches in this project. We looked at a random choice approach and a random swept slice approach. Now these are kind of subtly different but we did get different results using each approach. The random choice approach looked at combining a random n healthy observations and another random n unhealthy observations to create a testing data set. And then we used the remaining observations as the training data set. All right. In the random swept slice approach, we randomly choose a starting point, and then we select the next n consecutive observations to create a testing data set. So what this does is this maintains some continuity in the data instead of just taking random snapshots of the population. It would be very similar to saying, instead of randomly sampling the population of students at Penn State for a health screening, and you would instead randomly select a student and follow that student for a month, let's say. You would randomly select another student and follow that student for a month. So each student would present 30 data points, let's say, versus picking 30 students for one day each. And let me just say, we would make sure that we had proper review of those procedures, because we wouldn't want to be just testing individuals and personnel without proper approval. The next step in all of this is to evaluate the ability of each technique to accurately predict the testing data set. So we look at metrics such as accuracy, F1 scores, no information rate. Sorry about that. Where the hypothetical accuracy of a classifier predicts only the class which occurs most in the data set. The accuracy, no information rate, and the accuracy, no information rate p-value. So these are well-known metrics for judging the performance of classifiers. So what kind of results did we get? Using the random choice testing, we found that random forests and K-nearest neighbor classifications performed the best with this kind of data. Logistic regression fell somewhere in the middle, and linear discriminant analysis, naive Bayes, and support vector machines performed worse than the logistics regression. So our conclusion was, for this particular data set, nonlinear modeling techniques generally performed better than the more restricted linear modeling techniques. And I'd like to highlight that conclusion for you for a moment. One of the, in my own opinion, one of the advantages of modern machine learning techniques, many of which use neural networks, has been the fact that they really open up the analysis space to the development of and the use of nonlinear models, whereas many of our previous approaches, particularly those based on physics, tended to look at linear models or linearized nonlinear models, which really restricted the kinds of models that can be developed to describe the phenomena that we were seeing in the data. They also were limited to kind of small numbers of variables, because it's hard to get our minds around the relationships between different variables when we get to more than 3 or 4. What about the swept slice approach? So we still found that random forest was the best performing technique. The logistics regression, especially when limiting the variables used, performed reasonably well. As I mentioned, a lot of our linear techniques tend to perform really well with small numbers of variables, because it's easier to view and understand the connections. The slice approach seems more difficult than the random forest approach from an implementation standpoint, because we need to make sure that when we randomly select a point and then move forward from that point, that we're capturing only the healthy or capturing the unhealthy data We don't want to take random slices that mix both the healthy and unhealthy data together, because that will then confuse our training of the classifiers. And so what we see is there's periods of time where all models perform well, and then periods of time where none of the models perform well using this swept slice approach. When we look at the accuracy over the entire device history for all of the models, we see that there are periods of time where the models perform very well and periods of time where we get mixed results. And looking at the data more closely, what we see is the periods of time where the models perform very well have kind of stable operating conditions. So we're not seeing a lot of variability in the data that are caused by changes in operating conditions instead of changes in the health. So some conclusions from our kind of healthy versus unhealthy prediction experiments. We found that the random forest classifiers performed best so far here. We were able to predict a single continuous chunk of time. Predicting for a single continuous chunk of time is more difficult than predicting for an isolated number of points in time. And so one of the things that we're doing is exploring the differences between the time chunks, which perform well and time chunks which don't, to try to get some additional insight into how the analytics are working. And then looking at the multi-class prediction, where we have multiple stages of degradation, a number of faults and different combinations of incipient faults, is one of the places that we're going with this analysis. So next, I'd like to look at kind of so that's really more of a supervised learning approach, because we've assigned both designations of healthy and unhealthy to the data that we're using. Now let's look at a unsupervised approach, where we're trying to learn without labeled data. And in this case, we're trying to identify stages of degradation in diesel engines. So the objective was to use the available sensor data collected on the engines prior to a required maintenance action to establish stages of degradation for the developing fault. And then the goal is to use these stages of degradation to better identify vehicles with similar developing faults and improve our remaining useful life predictions. And the specific tools that we're using are self-organizing maps and convolution neural networks. Now, if you've worked with any vehicles, you'll know that modern vehicles have a number of different controllers on them. So in fact, your car has tens of controllers distributed throughout the system, everything from your tire inflation system to the transmission to the engine. We record this vehicle CAN bus data, we extract features, then we use some linear discriminant analysis to combine those features and get good separability. We're using Bayesian classifiers and then determining the stage of degradation, and from that, we're getting the remaining useful life. But before that, we're clustering the data into representative stages of life that we can then correlate with how long it is until the system is going to fail. So the kinds of data that we get from the CAN bus, from the controller area network bus, are things like speeds, temperatures, pressures, etc. Note that what we don't have is we do not have high sample rate time series data from things like vibration sensors mounted on the engine, or a high speed, high sample rate pressure measurement for things like fuel delivery. So in order to process this data, the first thing we have to do is select the channel. Then for this experiment, or for the results that I'm going to show you here, we limited ourselves to idle conditions because we wanted to take out some of the operating effects from the data. We standardized the data, which is really just a term for meaning that we normalize the data so that we don't have wide ranges of changes in the amplitudes that can then try to lend a more importance to some data than the others. And this is standard practice in the development of machine learning analysis. We used principal component analysis to reduce the dimensionality of the data that we're using in the machine learning algorithms. And then we use self-organizing maps to cluster the data. And this is part of our process of determining the stages of life. Then we divide the data into runtime groups from the time that the engine is started to the time it shuts down. And we use convolutional neural network for identifying the classes from the self-organizing map two-dimensional images. Now, self-organizing maps are interesting because unlike other neural networks where you feed data in and you get a classification out, what we look at with the self-organizing maps is the excitation of the neurons. Similar to the way that doctors use things like functional MRIs to look for parts of the brain that are activated when you see, hear, taste, or smell a certain stimulus. And what we see is with the self-organizing maps, in the early stage, we see certain neurons that have a lot of activity. As we go to a moderate stage of degradation, we see different neurons activated. And then when we go to a more severe stage, we see yet another group of neurons that are activated. And so what we do is we train our self-organizing maps to recognize the different stages of degradation. And then we can look at the performance of the self-organizing map to identify whether a new vehicle fits the severe stage, the moderate stage, or the early stage of degradation. Now, this is where our convolution neural networks come into play. Convolution neural networks are used very much in facial recognition and image recognition. And so they've been a great tool to take the kind of analysis that humans do very well, which is comparing one image to another and automating that algorithmically. And that's probably one of the biggest changes over time in the adoption of AI and ML techniques has been our ability to easily apply machine learning to replicate the kind of recognition that we're so good at ourselves. And so what's next in this work? We want to refine the convolution neural networks and the self-organizing map and other components using more vehicle fault data to improve and validate performance. In parallel with that, we're taking another approach which takes the data and doesn't use the data to determine the health, but uses the data to classify how the vehicle is being operated. In the example that I showed you, we limited ourselves to idle conditions, but you can see that in the future, we can separate the data based on load, whether the vehicles are being operated on road or off road, whether they're carrying, what kind of cargo they're carrying, and then further partition the data so that there's a little more context to the analysis. So what are the challenges? Finding the best inputs, filtering and determining the proper size of the self-organizing map so that we're not overwhelming ourselves with too many dimensions to analyze. And then finding convolutional neural networks that are most suitable to this type of data and information. And then hopefully being able to use things like transfer learning so that once we develop one convolutional neural network, we can reuse it for another application. So finally, I'll leave you with a couple of perspectives on AI and ML from my work over the years. Machine learning and AI have been around for a long time. While we're developing new techniques, the approaches are really not new. The renewed interest is really due to the success in business applications and image recognition. The thing that we have to keep in mind is there's a lot of data available for training and testing in these areas compared to what we have for machinery health monitoring. And verified ground truth data exists in those applications, which make supervised learning much easier to do. Advances in computational ability and processing architecture make these applications like deep neural networks practical. I mentioned earlier the fact that we have these running in our smartphones, and the availability of these approaches means that we can recast classification problems as image recognition problems and leverage these advances in deep learning neural networks. Also, deep learning neural networks can identify underlying structure and nonlinear relationships in systems that aren't captured by traditional reduced order physics-based models. We're seeing deep learning neural networks used to actually identify features, whereas before we had to engineer the features ourselves using subject matter experts and knowledgeable physicists, engineers, or experts from other domains. We would identify what we thought were the distinguishing characteristics and then feed those into our pattern recognition models. Now the deep learning neural networks are finding patterns hidden in the data, often due to nonlinear relationships that we can't conceive through our traditional physics-based and experiential-based feature engineering. Machinery health monitoring applications lack big data. So compared to financial transactions for a large company like Amazon, our data is pretty small, and it suffers from poorly labeled or unlabeled data, which makes supervised learning very difficult sometimes. So the last point I want to make is there's many examples of machine learning, but not a lot of applied artificial intelligence, in my opinion, where we're really attempting to replicate human subject matter expertise and knowledge. So I think that's one of the areas that we're going to see a lot of growth in, is going from simple classification and recognition to decision-making based on many different types of inputs. I hope you enjoy the roundtable and look forward to everyone's comments and participation. Thank you.